Story 1. The Phantom Whispers in the Woods. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, an escape from the bustle of city life. 4 friends, Sarah, Dylan, Marcus, and Chloe, decided to spend 2 nights in the dense woods of Vermont, a place known for its seclusion and unspoiled beauty. The site they chose was miles away from the nearest town, with nothing but endless trees surrounding them. They were all experienced campers, and the isolation excited them more than it worried them. The first night went smoothly. They set up camp, roasted marshmallows by the fire, and shared ghost stories, laughing at each other's ridiculous attempts to spook the group. But as the night wore on, the wind began to pick up, and an unsettling stillness enveloped the forest. The wildlife, so lively earlier, seemed to disappear. Sarah noticed it first. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her face paling. The group stopped talking and listened. At first, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire. Then, they heard it, a soft whispering just beyond the tree line. It was faint, like a voice carried by the wind. No one could make out the words, but the tone was undeniably eerie, as if someone or something was speaking in a language they couldn't understand. Dylan, the skeptic of the group, rolled his eyes. "It's probably the wind. Don't let the ghost stories get to your head." But Sarah wasn't convinced. The whispering seemed to grow louder, circling their camp, coming from every direction at once. Chloe grabbed Marcus's arm, her breath shallow. "It's not the wind," she whispered. Despite their growing fear, the group stayed put, convincing themselves it was just their imagination. They went to bed, though sleep didn't come easy. Sarah lay awake, listening to the faint murmurings that persisted through the night, only stopping when dawn approached. The next morning, they decided to shake off the strange events of the night before and go for a hike. The trail was rugged and steep, but the fresh air and sunlight seemed to lift their spirits. As they ventured deeper into the forest, they came across a strange sight, an old, dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. The wood was rotting, and the door hung off its hinges, but it didn't look like it had been abandoned for long. Marcus, ever the curious one, suggested they explore it. Reluctantly, the others agreed. The inside of the cabin was as eerie as the outside. Dusty furniture, broken windows, and a sense of abandonment hung in the air. But something caught Chloe's eye, a set of fresh footprints in the dirt, leading toward the back of the cabin. "Someone's been here," she whispered, her voice shaking. They followed the footprints to a small, musty room in the back. There they found something even more unsettling, an old journal, its pages yellowed with age, lying open on a table. Dylan picked it up and began reading aloud. "They come at night. The voices, they whisper, calling me. I don't know how long I can resist." The group exchanged horrified glances. The last entry in the journal was dated only a few days ago. They quickly left the cabin, but as they made their way back to camp, the unsettling feeling followed them. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time, closer. Sarah was the first to break. "I can't do this," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave." But it was already too late. As they packed up their gear in a frenzy, the whispers became distinct, forming words. They all heard it now, clear as day. "You can't leave. Not yet." Panic set in, and they fled into the woods, abandoning their tents and supplies. The whispering followed them, growing louder with every step. They ran until they reached the car, not daring to look back. It wasn't until they were miles away that the voices finally stopped. To this day, none of them speak of what happened in those woods. They never went back to retrieve their gear, and the cabin remains a mystery. But the whispers, they still haunt their dreams. Story 2, The Missing Camper. Jason had always been an avid solo camper. He enjoyed the solitude and found peace in being surrounded by nature. One summer, he decided to embark on a 2-week camping trip deep in the Appalachian Mountains. His friends warned him about the dangers of camping alone in such a remote area, but Jason brushed off their concerns. He was experienced, after all. The first few days were perfect. The weather was mild, and Jason spent his time hiking, fishing, and enjoying the tranquility. But on the fourth day, something strange happened. While gathering firewood, Jason noticed something odd, a series of small stone piles, meticulously arranged along the trail. They weren't natural formations. Someone had made them. Jason felt a chill, but told himself it was nothing. Maybe another camper had passed through recently. But that night, as he sat by his campfire, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The forest seemed too quiet, the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The following morning, Jason woke to find something even more unsettling. Around his tent, the same stone piles had appeared, this time much closer. They formed a perfect circle around his campsite. His heart raced as he realized there was no way this was a coincidence. Someone had been there, watching him while he slept. He packed up his gear and decided to cut the trip short. As he made his way back to the trailhead, the feeling of being followed intensified. He kept glancing over his shoulder, but saw nothing. Still, the oppressive sense of dread grew heavier with each step. By the time he reached his car, Jason was nearly running. He threw his gear into the back seat and peeled out of the parking lot, not daring to look back. It wasn't until he was halfway home that he finally relaxed. He turned on the radio and tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. A few days later, Jason received a call from the park rangers. They had found his campsite. But there was something strange. In the clearing where he had set up camp, they found more stone piles, hundreds of them, arranged in intricate patterns. No one could explain it, and no other campers had reported seeing anything unusual in the area. Jason has never returned to the Appalachian Mountains. Story 3. The Creature by the Lake. In the summer of 2016, a group of 6 friends, including Nick, Claire, Alex, and Emily, decided to go camping near a remote lake in northern Canada. The lake was beautiful, clear blue water surrounded by thick forests and steep cliffs. They had heard about the spot from a local who claimed it was a hidden gem, untouched by tourists. The first 2 days were idyllic. They spent their time swimming, fishing, and exploring the forest. But on the third night, something strange happened. As they sat around the campfire, they heard a loud splash coming from the lake. It wasn't the sound of a fish jumping or a rock being thrown. It was bigger, more forceful, like something massive had disturbed the water. They grabbed their flashlights and walked to the shore, but the lake was calm, the surface undisturbed. Shrugging it off, they returned to the fire, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Later that night, as they slept, Claire woke up to the sound of something heavy moving through the woods near their campsite. She sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The sound was getting closer. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. She shook Nick awake, her eyes wide with fear. He grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the trees, but saw nothing. Just as they were about to relax, a low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness. It wasn't like anything they had ever heard before. The growl was deep, primal, and sent a wave of terror through the group. They huddled together in the center of the camp, flashlights darting in every direction, but they couldn't see whatever was making the noise. Suddenly, the growl stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. For the rest of the night, they stayed awake, clutching makeshift weapons and listening for any sign of movement. When dawn finally broke, they packed up their gear and left as quickly as possible. As they drove away, Alex looked out the window and noticed something horrifying. A set of massive footprints in the mud near the shore of the lake, far too large to be human. Whatever had been stalking them that night was no ordinary animal. They never spoke about what they had seen, but they all knew one thing for sure. Something was living in that lake, something ancient and dangerous. Story 1. The Hitchhiker. It was a rainy autumn night, and Alex was driving along a lonely, winding road through the countryside. The rain was relentless, and the wipers on his old car struggled to keep up. The clock on the dashboard read 11:45 p.m., and he was tired, eager to get home after visiting his sister in the neighboring town. The road was dark and empty, with only the sound of the rain and the rhythmic hum of his engine for company. As Alex rounded a sharp bend, his headlights illuminated something ahead. A figure standing by the roadside, drenched in rain. It was a woman, her long hair plastered to her face, and she was wearing a tattered dress that looked far too thin for the cold night. Without thinking, Alex slowed the car and rolled down the window. "Do you need a ride?" he called out, shouting over the downpour. The woman looked up, her eyes wide and empty, as if in shock. She nodded silently and opened the passenger door. Without a word, she slipped into the seat, water dripping onto the floor of the car. Alex felt a chill, not just from the cold, but from the strange presence of his new passenger. "Where are you headed?" he asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. The woman finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just ahead." Alex nodded and kept driving. As the miles passed, the woman's silence became unnerving. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye, but she was just staring straight ahead, her expression blank. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. A few minutes later, they passed a small, weathered sign indicating a village up ahead. "Is this where you're going?" he asked, but she didn't respond. As they neared the village, Alex began to notice the woman was growing paler by the minute. Her skin had an unnatural pallor, and her breathing was shallow. His heart pounded in his chest. Something wasn't right. He pulled into a small gas station near the entrance of the village and turned to her, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, drenched with rainwater, but there was no trace of her. Alex sat there, frozen with terror. He hadn't stopped the car. The door hadn't opened. She had simply vanished. Later that night, after composing himself, Alex decided to ask a local resident at the gas station about what had just happened. When he described the woman, the attendant's face went pale. "You saw her?" he asked, his voice trembling. "That woman. She died on this road years ago. She's been haunting it ever since, appearing on rainy nights just like this one, asking for rides, but never making it home." Alex sped out of the village, refusing to look back. For the rest of his life, he never drove that road again, especially not on rainy nights. Story 2, The Visitor. The rain hammered against the windows of the old farmhouse as Nora sat by the fireplace reading. The wind howled outside, making the trees sway violently in the storm. It was a night perfect for staying indoors, and Nora was content to enjoy her solitude. Her husband, Greg, was away on a business trip, leaving her alone in the house for the weekend. The house was old, creaky, and isolated, exactly the kind of place that could stir the imagination during a storm. But Nora wasn't the type to get spooked easily. Just as she was getting comfortable, there was a loud knock on the front door. Startled, she set her book aside and listened. It was late, and the storm outside was vicious. Who would be out on a night like this? Another knock came, louder this time, echoing through the empty house. Nora cautiously approached the door, peeking through the peephole. There was no one there. Confused, she unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The cold wind blew rain into her face, but the porch was empty. The long driveway was completely dark. She shut the door, locking it tight, and went back to her chair, dismissing it as her imagination. But the moment she sat down, the knock came again, this time louder and more insistent. Nora's heart raced. She ran to the door, flung it open, and stepped out onto the porch, searching for any sign of someone. The rain was pouring so heavily she could barely see the yard. And yet, there was no one. She closed the door once more, but as soon as she turned around, the lights flickered and went out. The house was plunged into darkness, save for the dim glow of the fire. Panic set in. Nora grabbed her phone to call Greg, but the line was dead. No service. Suddenly she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from upstairs. She froze, fear gripping her like never before. Greg wasn't home, and no one else should be in the house. The footsteps grew louder, moving down the hallway above her. Heart pounding, she quietly moved toward the kitchen, grabbing the nearest weapon she could find, a large kitchen knife. She stood there, clutching the knife, her back to the wall, listening. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and began descending, one step at a time. Nora's breath hitched. She couldn't see anything in the darkness, but she could hear them, clear as day. Suddenly, the front door burst open, slamming against the wall. In the flickering firelight, she saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. A tall, gaunt figure, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It didn't move, just stood there, dripping wet, staring at her. Nora screamed, dropped the knife, and ran toward the back door. As she fumbled with the lock, the footsteps grew faster, racing toward her. Just as she managed to get the door open, she felt something ice cold grab her shoulder. Everything went black. When Nora woke up, it was morning. The storm had passed and the house was eerily quiet. She was lying on the kitchen floor, unharmed but shaken to her core. The front door was wide open, but there was no sign of anyone. No wet footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. To this day, Nora doesn't know who or what came to visit her that rainy night, but she swears every time there's a storm she hears footsteps in the house coming down the stairs. Story 3. The Crying Child. Mark and Sarah were driving back from a late dinner, the rain coming down in sheets. The country road they were on was deserted, the headlights barely cutting through the storm. The car's tires splashed through puddles, making the drive slow and treacherous. It was well past midnight, and both of them were tired, eager to get home. As they rounded a bend in the road, Mark suddenly hit the brakes. Standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the car's headlights, was a small child, soaked to the bone, wearing a white nightgown. The child stood there motionless, staring at them with wide, terrified eyes. Mark quickly put the car in park and stepped out, shouting over the rain, "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The child didn't respond, just stared at him, trembling. Sarah, concerned, stepped out of the car and walked toward the child. "It's okay, sweetie. We'll help you. Where do you live?" As Sarah reached out to touch the child's arm, the little girl suddenly turned and ran into the woods, disappearing into the thick trees. Without thinking, Sarah took off after her, calling for the child to stop. Mark yelled after her, but the rain drowned out his voice. Frantic, he ran into the woods, following Sarah's fading silhouette. The forest was dense and dark, and the rain made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Mark stumbled through the mud, shouting Sarah's name, but there was no response. Minutes passed, then hours, as he searched desperately for his wife and the child, but there was no sign of them. He called for help, but when the police arrived, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. Sarah had vanished without a trace, and the child was never seen again. Mark later learned from locals that the area had a dark history. Years ago, a young girl had drowned in a nearby river during a storm, and ever since, people had reported seeing her ghost wandering the roads, leading them into the woods, never to return. Mark never gave up searching for Sarah, but he never found her. To this day, on rainy nights, drivers still report seeing a little girl in a white nightgown, standing on that lonely road, waiting for someone to stop. Story 1. The Phantom Hitchhiker. It was a crisp autumn evening when Lisa set out on a night drive to visit her parents, who lived in a small town nestled in the countryside. She'd done the trip countless times before, but something about that night felt different. The moon, half hidden behind thick clouds, cast an eerie glow on the winding road ahead. The trees lining the sides swayed ominously in the cool wind, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers toward the asphalt. Lisa was used to driving alone, but the silence inside the car was unnerving. She flicked on the radio, hoping for some music to ease her nerves, but only static greeted her. With a sigh, she turned it off and focused on the road ahead. After about 20 minutes of driving, she noticed a figure standing on the side of the road, right under the faint glow of a streetlight. It was a woman, standing still, her thumb out in the universal hitchhiking gesture. Ordinarily, Lisa would never stop for a hitchhiker, especially at night, but something about the woman tugged at her. She looked desperate, her clothes disheveled and hair wild, but her face was hauntingly beautiful, with deep-set eyes that seemed to plead for help. Against her better judgment, Lisa slowed down and rolled down the passenger side window. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaky. The woman stepped closer, her movements slow, almost deliberate. "Can you take me to the next town?" Her voice was soft but strangely cold, sending a shiver down Lisa's spine. She hesitated but nodded, unlocking the door. The woman slid into the seat without a word, her gaze fixed straight ahead. As Lisa pulled back onto the road, the silence in the car felt suffocating. She tried to make small talk, but the woman didn't respond. Her eyes remained focused on the darkness outside, her hands resting motionless on her lap. Minutes ticked by, and the unease in Lisa's chest grew. She glanced at her passenger, and that's when she noticed something odd. There was no reflection of the woman in the rearview mirror. Panic clawed at her throat. Her pulse quickened as she gripped the steering wheel tighter. You're not real, are you?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. The woman slowly turned her head, and for the first time, Lisa saw her eyes fully. They were dark, hollow pits, as if someone had carved them out. Her lips twisted into a chilling smile, and she leaned closer. "I've been looking for someone like you for a long time." Terrified, Lisa slammed on the brakes, swerving the car to the side of the road. The woman let out a bone-chilling laugh, and before Lisa could react, the passenger seat was empty. The door hadn't opened, but the woman was gone. Lisa sat there for what felt like hours, heart pounding in her chest, staring at the empty seat. Eventually, she mustered the courage to drive away, her hands shaking on the wheel. But no matter how fast she drove, the feeling of being watched never left her. To this day, Lisa never drives that road alone again. Story 2. The Gas Station Stranger. Jake had been on the road for hours. The long highway stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated only by his car's headlights. He was driving home from a business trip that had dragged on longer than expected, and all he wanted was to be back in his own bed. Around midnight, he noticed the fuel gauge was nearing empty. The nearest gas station was miles away, and Jake's heart sank at the thought of being stranded in the middle of nowhere. When he finally spotted a small, dimly lit gas station at the side of the road, relief washed over him. The station looked old, almost abandoned, but the neon open sign flickered weakly in the window. Jake pulled in, parking near the lone pump. The place felt wrong, too quiet, too isolated. But he had no choice. He stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at his skin, and began pumping gas. As he stood there, Jake heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see a man walking toward him from the darkness. The man was tall, wearing a long coat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, but Jake could make out a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Need some help?" the man asked, his voice low and raspy. Jake shook his head, trying to remain polite despite the growing unease in his gut. "I've got it, thanks." The man stepped closer, his movements unnervingly smooth. "You sure? It's late. Dangerous to be out here all alone." Jake's skin crawled. He could feel the man's eyes on him, watching him too intently. He tried to focus on the gas pump, willing it to fill faster. "I'm good," he muttered. The man chuckled softly, but there was no warmth in the sound. "You know, people go missing out here all the time. They vanish, and no one ever finds them." Jake's heart raced. He wanted to get back in his car, lock the doors, and drive as far as possible, but the gas pump was taking forever. The man took another step closer, now standing mere feet away. "Be a shame if something happened to you tonight," the man whispered. The gas pump clicked off, signaling that the tank was full. Jake yanked the nozzle out, his hands trembling, and quickly screwed the cap back on. He didn't look at the stranger as he rushed to get back in his car. As soon as he slammed the door shut, he locked it. The man was standing by the passenger side window now, still smiling that eerie, unnatural smile. Jake started the engine, but before he could pull away, the man leaned down, his face inches from the glass. "You're not the first," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "And you won't be the last." Jake didn't wait to hear more. He floored the gas pedal, tires screeching as he sped out of the station. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but the man was gone, vanished into the night as if he had never been there. Jake didn't stop until he reached the safety of a well-lit rest stop miles down the road. To this day, He avoids late-night drives and never stops at isolated gas stations again. Story 3. The Watcher in the Woods. Sarah and her friends had been driving for hours, enjoying a spontaneous road trip through the back roads of their rural state. The night had started off fun, full of laughter and music, but as they ventured deeper into the woods, the mood shifted. The trees grew denser, and the narrow road wound through the forest like a snake. It was nearly 2 a.m. when they found themselves completely lost. Their GPS had stopped working, and there were no signs of civilization in sight. The only sound was the hum of the car engine and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. As they drove deeper into the forest, the car's headlights caught something moving at the edge of the road. A figure, tall and thin, darting between the trees. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. Her friends exchanged nervous glances. "Probably just an animal," one of them suggested, though they didn't sound convinced. They continued driving, but now everyone was on edge. The darkness outside the car felt oppressive, as if the night itself was closing in on them. Then they saw it again. The figure, this time closer, its limbs impossibly long and its movements unnaturally fast. "Did you see that?" one of her friends shouted. "Yes," Sarah whispered, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The figure appeared again, this time directly in front of the car. Sarah slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a sudden halt. The figure was gone. They sat there in stunned silence, hearts pounding, when suddenly the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered and went out, leaving them in complete darkness. Panic set in. One of her friends tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. They were stranded, alone in the middle of the woods, with something or someone watching them. Suddenly there was a loud bang on the roof of the car, followed by a scraping sound. Sarah's heart raced as she looked up through the windshield, but all she could see was darkness. "What do we do?" one of her friends whispered, voice shaking. Before anyone could respond, the car started rocking violently, as if something or someone was trying to tip it over. They screamed, huddling together in the back seat, praying for it to stop. After what felt like an eternity, the rocking ceased. The air around them was eerily still. Then, from the shadows, a voice, soft, barely audible, whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." Without warning, the engine roared to life, and the headlights flickered back on. Sarah didn't waste a second. She floored the gas, speeding down the road as fast as she could. They didn't stop until they reached the safety of a small town hours later. None of them ever spoke of what happened in the woods that night, but the memory of the figure, of the Watcher, haunts Sarah to this day.